Good. Windows in the right place. So let everybody can see what they're supposed to see. Just takes a minute. But it always feels a little longer than like. Got it. Okay, just a few more clicks. And we'll be in. Then I think we've hit our time since that little tech glitch made things run a little bit more slowly getting everything loaded up, but I think we are okay now. All right, now, normally I would be sharing my text, but I want to do a little bit more of an introduction to start than I normally do, because, well, this is the first in our series. And as such, let me just hit everything there. Because this is the first in a series, I want to make sure that everybody knows what to expect. Some of you have studied with me before, and that's great. Welcome back. Some of you may not. Who knows how you found this video through the wonderful algorithm? Maybe a friend shared it, but you might not know my own style, my own process of handling this type of classical Jewish topic. So we are looking at the topic of the end of days, which is a extremely provocative topic because it doesn't really fit the Jewish nomenclature, but it is something that is used in common language a lot, especially over the last few hundred years, and especially over the last century. There are many people that around the world believe that the world is wrapping up, that God, in whichever version they believe, is bringing the world to its conclusion, that we are living through the end times, and many of them will sell you tickets for front row seats to whatever is about to happen. Now, because of that, it means that within Judaism, people get a saturated pop culture or alternative theology impression of what religion believes about the end of the world. And things like Armageddon and the apocalypse and all of that are part of the media and thus cultural landscape. If you ask anybody about the apocalyptic genre, they can point to movies, whether it be nuclear, zombie, illness, aliens, or religious. People have many concepts of how the world might end and what would happen and what it would be like. None of them, by the way, especially particularly pleasant. Judaism has a much older and a much more reasonable tradition regarding what we are looking for in the transition of this world into its next phase. And I'm using very vague language in particular because I want to have this be a process of discovery, and I want this to be a process of building up without preconceived notions of what to expect. So please, lay aside whatever you might think you know. It might be true, it might not, about what Judaism believes on this topic, and allow yourself to discover some of the issues. Now, as we get started, I want to start with a very common misconception. And that misconception is that Judaism doesn't really care about what happens next. You will often hear this phrase, something along the lines of, Judaism is very focused on this world, on this life, and as such, we don't really care about what happens next. We don't care about the afterlife, and we don't care about the coming of a Messiah figure or anything else like that. Now, that's wrong. And we're going to look through some very clear examples of how we know the claim that Judaism doesn't care about the future is wrong. But it does come from two different sources. That misconception comes from two sources. One is perfectly valid, and that is that, indeed, the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy, does not emphasize the question of the end of days. It does not emphasize the coming of what we'll be discussing as a Messiah figure. It does not emphasize that type of millennialist mindset. Instead, it does absolutely focus on what our responsibilities are to God and to each other, which is a form of our responsibility to God, in this life itself. So that general sense that Judaism does spend a massive amount of its attention budget on telling us how to live is absolutely true. But to argue from that ratio of attention that Judaism cares nothing about what comes next is a misconception. And one of the places that misconception was born was in the 1800s. And this is part of what has confused many people in the modern world. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, and we're going to be going through a lot of different texts. But I want to start with a text that is widely considered to be incorrect, even by the descendants of the people who originally prepared it. So let's go ahead and get this up. Make sure that that is streaming, and we should be good. Okay. So what we are looking at here is an excerpt from the Pittsburgh Platform. The Pittsburgh Platform in 1885 was one of the first broad statements of principle among the early reform movement, having begun only officially 40-some years prior, although culturally having begun much longer than that. The reform movement felt it advisable to speak about what it actually believed. We're going to look at a couple of their formal statements of belief, and then we'll talk about why they felt it was necessary to make these claims. And then we'll talk about how the reform movement has walked it back since. And then we will begin to look at some alternative texts that are making a whole different set of claims about what Judaism believes. And many texts that you might find familiar, if you're familiar with Judaism at all, but we'll hopefully be able to establish in this first session that a belief in something coming next is not only part of Judaism, but it is a central part of Judaism, and it's one that is meant to give us, sorry, not a cough, but it's one that's meant to give us a guidance for how we are meant to approach this world, this life, as well as conceptualize what's next. So starting off, here's what they had to say in 1885 in the Reform movement. We recognize in the modern era of universal culture, of heart and intellect, the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. So, to translate from 19th century speak, basically they are saying we are already in messianic times. That because the modern era is full of a universal culture of heart and intellect, everybody is so nice, that we have already begun establishing kingdoms of trust, justice, and peace among all men, and that's great. And furthermore, they argued, we consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. And as you can see in the second half, they are saying that while they hold to their religion, the peoplehood or national idea of Judaism is no longer relevant, and that all of the long looked for elements of this time in the future are no longer something that they are seeking or expecting. So this is a major break, as they are claiming, with Jewish tradition. So already we can see by their rejection what had been considered to be a commonplace idea for Jewish belief. One, a messianic hope for the establishment of a kingdom of truth, justice, and peace. They believe it had already been fulfilled, but they are still acknowledging that that is a Jewish belief, and that there would be, in classical Judaism, a return to the land of Israel, then called Palestine under the Ottoman rule, and a restoration of sacrifices and a restoration of other laws concerning the Jewish state. We're going to go into a lot more detail about all of those points eventually, but notice what they are claiming in their rejection were common beliefs in Judaism. In part 7 of their platform, we reassert the doctrine of Judaism that the soul is immortal, grounding the belief in the divine nature of human spirit, which forever finds bliss in righteousness and misery in wickedness. So they believe in right and wrong. They believe that the soul has an eternal element and that it is impacted by our behaviors. We reject as ideas not rooted in Judaism the beliefs both in bodily resurrection, that is to say that in some future time, people would become alive again, would be resurrected physically, and in Gehenna and Eden, often translated as hell and paradise, as abodes for everlasting punishment and reward. So you can see within these rejections, a acknowledgement of what were more common beliefs generally. Now, I warn you, all of these terms that they are rejecting have a lot of detail within them. So even if we were to say, whatever they're rejecting must be true, just saying that Jews believe in Eden or Gehenna does not mean that we believe in what you conceive of them to believe. That doesn't mean that hell looks like what you think hell is. That doesn't mean paradise looks like what you might think the word paradise means. Now, why did the Reform movement feel it necessary to make this an official statement? It had already been discussed and studied for many decades prior. Well, primarily because it turns out that many European and Americans were uncomfortable with Jews. I know it's a shock that there was anti-Semitism in the 1800s. Who would have ever imagined it in this wonderful place of truth, justice, and peace among all men? But there was a great deal of anti-Semitism, and one of the common lines of attack that was used by anti-Semites against Jews and against offering Jews full emancipation and participation within society was that we considered ourselves to be separate, that we were pining away for a restoration of our people, and therefore we didn't consider ourselves to be part of the local people. Because after all, if we're all just imagining that we will one day go back to the land of Israel, in the meantime, how could we be considered good Frenchmen or British subjects or American citizens? Because we weren't really part of the group, we were always waiting to leave. And that was used as a line of attack by many eminent anti-Semites. And the Reform movement thought that by officially rejecting that type of messianic hope, that we would be more easily accepted within the general culture. Likewise, the idea that we are not looking for a bodily resurrection and not looking for these other notions that at the time were popularly understood to be all physical, meaning of suffering and paradise, well, that was a way to seem more rational and more modern. This was the same sort of idea that was going around many other Christian denominations in Europe and North America as well. So the Reform platform here was part of the general culture of its era, and it was also an attempt to blunt the attacks of anti-Semites. Unfortunately, it did little to blunt the attacks of anti-Semites because it turns out most anti-Semites decide that they hate Jews first, and then will come up with a list of reasons that they would like to explain as roots of their hatred. But the hatred actually came originally from things completely unrelated to what they are describing. That's why Jews can be hated for both being rich and poor in the same country at the same time. We're not going to go into anti-Semitism in great detail today, although rising above anti-Semitism will certainly be part of that messianic hope that we'll discuss in more detail. Now, as I mentioned before, but I will repeat, the modern Reform movement of 2026 does not agree with the Pittsburgh platform. It has been repealed and replaced multiple times. I recommend to you their website, and you can see more about their history of statement and belief, but they no longer ascribe to the values and ideas put here in the Pittsburgh platform. So please don't think you understand the modern Reform movement just because we studied two little paragraphs out of the Pittsburgh platform from 150 years ago. Talk to your Reform friends, find out what they believe, talk to Reform clergy, find out what the movement stands for. I am a conservative rabbi, but I think it is instructive still to see where this idea, this misconception that Jews don't focus on the next world, on the coming future, originated. And part of it, as I said, is indeed because we focus more on this world here and now and our own adherence to the commandments and fulfillment of our duty in this life. But part of it is also because both the Reform movement formally and many other Jews less formally bought into the idea that we shouldn't accentuate our longing for a vision of the future that was different than the present that we were currently being potentially offered through our non-Jewish neighbors who were in charge of those countries in which we live. Okay, so now that we've got the basic idea of why you might think that we don't care enough about the future, let's go ahead and prove that Jews absolutely care about the future. And we're going to do that today by looking at one of the most familiar and least read Jewish books. It's second only really to the Torah for being familiar and not read, and that is the Siddur. Now, you're probably all saying, but wait a minute, Rabbi, I go to services all the time. I love the Siddur. I sing the prayers. I know the words, and that's great. That's wonderful. See you at services. However, if you haven't paid careful attention, it is sometimes easy to miss the underlying themes that run throughout the entirety of the Siddur that are related to these topics. And so we're going to sort of look at some of the familiar passages. Hopefully I'll be able to draw your attention to some of the key words and phrases that are found within them. And we'll talk a little bit about what they are hinting at. I say hinting because in order to do this class properly, once we've finished our survey of the Siddur and we've at least got a broad vocabulary for some of the main topics that are in Jewish thought, we are then going to go back and we are going to essentially move historically through these ideas. We're going to go back to biblical texts. We will then look at rabbinic texts from the era of Mishnah, Midrash, and Talmud. Then we will move into the great philosophical works. And finally, look through both history as well as modern times of how these ideas have impacted us. So as I said at the outset, this will be in it for the long haul. I'll try and do a summation at the end like I did for my class on suffering. But really, this is about learning the details. It's not meant as a broad aerial view. We're going to get down in the weeds. So let's start in those weeds in our Siddur. So beginning with the Avot and the Gevurot, with two passages that were actually changed in the Reformed Siddur, but these are the classical form as you'll find them in our own modern Siddur in our synagogue. So in Avot, which is the first blessing of the Amidah, one of the things that we use as a statement of praise of God's relationship with us, of God's connection to us, which is the central theme of Avot, of this prayer, is Umevi Goel livnei b'neihem l'ma'an shemo b'yahava. That God is the one, excuse me, I don't know what's going on with my throat right now. That God is the one who brings, or rather will bring, or in the process of bringing, grammar is a little tricky, a redeemer to their children's children for the sake of his name, meaning God's name, with love, or lovingly, will lovingly bring a redeemer. Many ways you can render this into English. This is simply a more simplistic translation, but don't take it as being definitive or authoritative. So this concept that we are dealing with here is that there is this character, if you will, of a Goel, of a redeemer. Hold on to that word, Goel, because we are going to come across it multiple times. But recognize that this is something that is said 3 times every day in Jewish prayer, 4 if it is Shabbat or a holiday, and we add the additional Musaf prayer, and that every time we come across this, we are talking about a redemption model for the future. The second line is also taken from the Avot, where we list many of God's great titles: Melech, Ozer, Umoshia, Umagen. A king, a ruler that is, a helper, a deliverer, and a shield. Melech, the king, we'll come back to that in more detail in some of the other blessings, but I want to take a look at this other word, Umoshia, a deliverer. Okay, this concept of deliverance or salvation, which is what that word could be translated to into in English, is going to be a slippery term for today. And I apologize for that, but there's no way to clarify exactly what Judaism means by this word without looking at many more examples. Because unfortunately, the moment I say deliverer or savior, people immediately will add in English definitions of that word. English examples of that word and examples from other religious traditions, non-Jewish traditions. So for the moment, understand that we are praising God as being the one who brings deliverance or salvation. We are praising God as our Moshiach, as the one. Do recognize that Moshiach is not the same word as Mashiach. It's easy to get those mixed up if you're not familiar with how Hebrew is done. Mashiach means somebody that is anointed, a very important concept that we will talk about in much more detail in future classes. But Moshiach is the form for the verb to save or deliver. The savior or the deliverer would be the best translation. Okay, again, we will come across that word a lot. We'll build up our understanding. Here, at least recognize the context in which it is coming. This is considered to be a synonym, or at least a parallel idea, as God as king, God as helper, God as shield. So hopefully that's already beginning to give you a little bit more of a parameters of what this word means Jewishly, but we will build up more examples as we go. In particular, in the next blessing of the Amidah, known as the Givurot. This blessing emphasizes God's might, God's power, and it begins, the very first line, Ata gibor leolam Adonai, mechaye metim, ata rav lehoshia. Right, so mechaye metim is our first introduction in our class to the concept of a giver of life to the dead. You may remember the Pittsburgh platform explicitly rejected this idea, and that was because it was baked into our tefillah, our prayers, and indeed the early Reform Sidurim did change this phrase. Modern Reform Sidurim usually will provide alternative options, including this more classic formulation. So, God is giving life to the dead appears to be a rather important and central concept in Judaism because it appears, again, 3 times every day, 4 on holidays and Shabbat. And then again, at the end, we see that God is our deliverer, the one to give deliverance, lehoshia, again, based off that same root word in Judaism. Now, what can we tell from this? Well, not much more than God gives life to the dead, but from the context now, that becomes an example of salvation, of saving us, which will become much more important as this course continues. As we see, the Givurot continues a little ways down, Mokayem emunato lishnei afar, and God is the one who maintains or fulfills his faithfulness, his loyalty to those that sleep in the dust, a reference again to the giving of life to the dead. And then after saying that nobody can compare to God or God's might, because after all, that is pretty amazing, we then follow up with Melech memid u'mechaye u'matzmiach Yeshua, that God is indeed the king that gives life to the dead and is the one that causes deliverance or salvation to sprout forth. Now that word matzmiach is another word that you will hear in its many different forms when talking about our vision of the future. And it's an odd choice for the English ear, because matzmiach literally means to sprout or cause to blossom. And that doesn't really work in most American poetry. But in biblical poetry, this is the common poetic motif for something to begin small and then open up and sprout forth. It's a phrase that is very much embedded in being a farmer and of watching your barren soil just sit there day after day after day, and you having to hope that it's going to be better. And then all of a sudden you see a tiny little shoot popping up from the first seeds that were planted. And then another, and then another, and then they grow and they grow and they grow. And then finally you have an entire field full of wheat, something that incidentally we would be watching our fields for right now if we were farmers in the land of Israel in ancient days, because we have the barley harvest already in or coming in, but the wheat harvest we are waiting to begin because it begins at the time of Shavuot. That's why we're counting the Omer. We are waiting for all of those little sprouts of wheat to fully blossom so that, well, Yeshua, so that there will be deliverance, that there will be salvation. Again, that is a hint for what we are looking for when we mean salvation. The Torah service is something, again, that is quite familiar to many, but we may not always be recognizing some of the elements that are in it that are focused towards this future vision. We praise God, Ava Rachamim, Hetiva V'Yosopcha, Et Sion, that God is going to have his goodness, his goodwill upon Zion, Zion being a stand-in for both the Jewish people in general, but in particular the city of Jerusalem. And indeed, the next phrase, Tivnei Chomot Yerushalayim, and God will build the walls, please, build the walls of Jerusalem. Again, we are talking about a metaphor here for building not only literal walls, but about building security and peace for the city of Jerusalem. To build the walls was a sign of full restoration, as is seen from the many texts that deal with our return from Babylon and are seeking to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem at that time as well. And then we finish this line just before we open the ark, Ki v'cha levad batachnu, because it's only in you that we trust, Melech, right? Because you are king, El Ram v'nisa Adon Olamim, and you are uplifted, exalted, master of all of time, infinity, the worlds, many ways to translate Olamim. Again, we get this repeat of God as king. Now that may seem rather prosaic to call God king, because after all, God gave us laws, he gave us the Torah, so God is king all the time. But we will notice that king is not only used in Judaism to discuss our current relationship with God, but it is also part of our aspirational understanding of the end of days. That there is something about God's malchut, God's kinghood, God's reign, that is exceptional in the coming times. And that is why we'll often see this word melech not only used for discussing the present, but also for the future, and in the future having a different feeling to it. Within the Torah blessing itself, one of the lines in the blessing after a reading reminds us, Asher natan lanu Torah emet, gave us a Torah of truth, seems perfectly relevant since we're just doing a blessing over Torah, but then it finishes, V'chaye olam nata b'tochenu, that you have planted within us, again, going to our farming metaphors, chaye olam, an eternal life. And this is another clue that Judaism considers the idea of the eternity of the soul, and perhaps as well, the eternity of our living existence in this world as part of its understanding of what the future will hold. And certainly we recognize that as important as the Torah is, like we talked about at the beginning, as the basic blueprint of how we live, as the centerpiece of what Jewish life is about, telling us what we must do and what we mustn't do, that we are also focused on what comes next. And so even while we are focused on the Torah itself in this blessing, we are still reminding ourselves of this eternity that comes in the future. All right, we're just running through these. Don't worry, we're not going to read all of this paragraph from the Aleinu, or at least we won't go through all of we won't emphasize everything. But in the Aleinu, there are three main portions. There is the introductory passage, Aleinu l'shabeach, that you're probably very familiar with. And then we do the bowing at the end of that section, and we then continue, Shuvun l'tei shamayim, that God is the one who spread out the heavens. Both of those are essentially backward and present looking. We are talking about what God has done, establishing the world, and we're talking about God establishing us, and that God continues to maintain that relationship with us and the world. However, the third paragraph, which is very often done quietly, although I do like to sing it when I have the chance to lead, actually is our most extensive vision for the future, found within our liturgy in our Siddur. It goes straight to the heart of it, of what elements of the future will look like. So we say, al kain nikaveh lecha, right? Because of this, we hope in you, right? Nikaveh is that word from hope. You might recognize it from the word hatikva, taken from the Israeli national anthem, that there is something more, right? It is not only that we are celebrating what God has done, we are also looking to the future. And in particular, what we are looking for in that future is that idolatry and all of that will be swept away, and letaken olam b'malchut Shaddai, that the world will be perfected in the sovereignty or the kingdom or reign of Shaddai, Shaddai being one of the other names of God. As I said just moments ago, this concept that the Malchut, the reign of God, is both current as well as aspirational is reflected right here. You'll also notice the phrase letaken olam as one that you might have heard in its other grammatical form, tikkun olam, for perfecting the world, a phrase that has had a long history and has have a confused understanding. Very often we use the word tikkun olam simply to mean doing what the Torah has asked us to do right here, right now, which is great. But as you can tell from its context here, the Taken Olam is also an aspirational term for something in the future where the world itself is transformed, seemingly almost in a way that is beyond our immediate control or understanding. So it is not solely mundane the way it is often portrayed. This is also a spiritual concept of looking towards the future. After continuing to discuss how the world will eventually come to recognize God and to see God as indeed being the king of all, we then say, "V'timloch aleihem mehera leolam va'ed, ki hamalchut shelcha hi ulamei ad timloch bechavod." Right, that then you will rule upon them, meaning the whole world, and this will come soon, and it will be forever because your kingship will be eternal. Again, this is not denying that God is currently king of the universe, because by all meaningful definitions, that seems to be true. However, it is recognizing that God's sovereignty is not universally acknowledged. So while God may be legitimately called the king, he is not recognized as king in every corner of the world. And this is what the aspiration is going towards. Now, what that recognition would entail, apart from the ideas of sweeping away idolatry, is something that we will discuss at length in later classes, because the kingdom of God is something, again, that is thrown around by many different groups and done so in ways that are wildly different than the Jewish conception of what the kingdom of God is supposed to look like. So we will definitely be coming back to this concept again and again. And then we finish it off with a phrase that's probably more familiar to those that hear it sung at the end. Kakatu b'toratecha Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed. It's written in your Torah, God will reign forever. And here, that phrase is taken from the Song of the Sea and explicitly being given a future spin. In context, in the original Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea, it is God is our king, and yay, that's great. But the prayer has taken it and said, and God will be king at some point in a way that is different than now, but will extend in perpetuity throughout the future. Okay. And then we finish off, B'ne'emar v'haya Adonai lamelech kol haaretz, and it'll be that God will be king over all the world. And again, it might seem confusing because after all, isn't God already king? Why are we hoping that God will be king? Well, that's what the prophet Zechariah said, and we will be looking at him in more detail later. Bayom hahu, and on that day, Yeh Adonai echad u'shmo echad, God will be one and his name one. Again, we're going to have to unpack that when we look at that in its particular understanding. But do notice this Bayom hahu that the prophet brings, that on that day, it is establishing that, yes, Judaism does believe there will be a Yom, there will be a day, there will be a moment, a time when things change. That the world as we see it now is not in its final form. This is not it. We're not done. There is something else that will eventually come. This is one of the most important things that we get on a day-to-day basis when we are reflecting on these prayers and their aspirational language, is that the world as it is, for which we are expressing our gratitude towards God and from which we derive our sense of awe of God, isn't done. It's amazing so far, and certainly enough to inspire us. But we recognize the world is not done in its development. There is more yet to come, and even better than we've already got. So this idea of a transition, of a future that is worth holding on to as a hope is something that has been critical throughout Jewish history, and something that I hope each of us can see is critical in the modern world as well, that we never think we're done, there's nothing better than this, or it will only get worse, but that Judaism constantly holds out this hope and belief in a future that will be better. Let's go through and just mark a few of the other places in the Siddur where these concepts are also repeated. Yotzer Or is the morning blessing, where we are celebrating God's creation. And of course, what do we say? Matzmiach Yeshuot, right? That God will cause deliverance to sprout forth. There is our sprouting again. And then Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir, that there will be this new light that shines upon Zion. Again, stand in for both the Jews in general, as well as Jerusalem and Israel, the country, and V'niskei Hulana Mehirav Oro, and we hope that we will be able to merit being in its brightness, that we are looking forward to that. Now, this line was actually controversial. These blessings that go after the Baruch Hu and before the Amidah, the ones that surround the Shema, are theologically, from the original description of our traditional texts, meant to be prayers of praise and thanksgiving, where we expound upon God's greatness by what we see, and we are grateful for what God has already blessed us for. This is part of the building up of our sense of awe, our sense of humility, our sense of gratitude. And originally, according to rabbinic description, they're not meant to contain petitions. And so the question then becomes, should we be asking God to shine a new light? Doesn't that look like we're ungrateful for the light that we currently have? Now, there is a lot of back and forth throughout history, although this has become standard in most Siddurim, of whether this line should be included or not. But for those that include it, like our congregation, for example, and most Ashkenazic congregations, the idea is that we are praising God, not per se petitioning, that we are recognizing God as the source that will bring redemption to the world, this new light, and as such, it is perfectly appropriate to list that among God's many accomplishments. I mean, after all, from God's point of view, this has already happened, even if we have to go the long route. In the prayer that comes after, Ahava Rabbah, in addition to all of its statements regarding God's loving gift of Torah, we again sneak in a number of seemingly petitional prayers that are reflective of that mood. We say, Nagila v'nismecha b'shuatecha. We want to rejoice and exult in your deliverance or salvation. There is our Yeshua again, our deliverance language. V'havi'enu l'shalom me'abakan fota aretz, and bring us peacefully from the four corners of the world. V'tolichenu kumiyut le'atzenu, and lead us upright, proudly into our land. Ki el poel Yeshua, because you are the God, you are the one that performs acts of deliverance. Again, why are we saying these lines in a prayer about Torah? Well, because the idea is that through Torah, through the loving gift that God gave us of Torah, we are on a path that will lead to this deliverance, that we will find this this salvation. Now, one other thing I want you to note here, which will become more and more apparent as we go, is this last word in this paragraph, Yeshuot, which is a plural form of that phrase of salvation. You'll notice that the English translator, which was not me, uses the singular idea of deliverance or acts of deliverance, I suppose, is bringing it up a little bit to the plural that it is. But Yeshuot would better be translated in English as deliverances or salvations. And that is something that you must bear in mind, that this idea of salvation is not a singular act. Oftentimes in many texts, you'll see salvation written with a capital S, or the salvation. and it implies that it is a singular moment. Not so. Judaism is going to use this phrase for deliverance and salvation as something that can be repeated, something that has a more general applicability than only the end of days. So hold on to that concept as we build up more evidence going through here. The blessing that comes after the Shema will remind us of God's faithfulness and loyalty. And indeed, we as Ezrat Avotenu Atahu Me'olam Magen Umoshia Livnehem Acharechem B'chol Dor Vador, that God has always been the help of our fathers, shield and deliverer to their children for every generation. Again, we get this Moshia, a deliverer, as being one of God's primary attributes. And we remind ourselves, Emet, it is true. Atahu Rishon v'atahu Acharon, you are the first, you are the last. Mibilavdecha ein lanu melech ro'el umoshir. And apart from you, we've got no other king, no other redeemer, and no other deliverer. Okay, deliverer and king we've talked about. Goel, however, we talked about a little bit in the Avot, that God would bring a deliverer to his people. But here we are seeing it put in contrast, but synonymous with the idea of being a king and deliverer. So how does a redeemer differ than a deliverer? And I thought we said in the original Avot that God would bring a deliverer and bring a redeemer, and yet here God is being described as that redeemer. That is something that we will have to unpack as we go through, because for being the Goel, be the redeemer, we need an example. And indeed, the example is brought in the prayer in the very next line. Mimitzrayim ge'altanu, right? From Egypt, you redeemed us from the house, from the life of bondage. You were the one that redeemed us from that. So redemption apparently is something that can describe what happened when we left Egypt, something that happened when we were taken out from slavery. So keep that in mind. Again, we're not finding long theological discussions in the Siddur, but we are finding constant references to what we believe the future looked like and using examples from the past to help us do that. Indeed, the prayer continues, Ram v'nisa gadol v'nora mashpil ge'im u'magbia shifalim, right? Because you are exalted and uplifted and great and awesome, and you humble the arrogant, and you will lift up those that have been humbled, those that are low. So this is a cycle, if you will, something that gets a little lost in this particular translation, because mashpil and shifalim, of course, are taken as being the same. So God will bring down those that are arrogant, and he will lift up those that are down. Motzi asirim, free those that are in bondage or captive. Ufudei anavim, and he will redeem in a slightly different form those that are humbled. Ve'ozer dalim, and he will help those that are poor or weak. Ve'onei la'amo be'et shav'am elav, and he will answer the call of his people when they cry out. Again, we are seeing this as being exemplified through the Exodus, where all of those things happened. But we are also reading this in the language of expectation, that this will be the future. And then after talking about God's uniqueness, we remind ourselves, Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed. We're not only echoing the song of the sea, but we are also reminding ourselves of this future idea of God's reigning. Again, something that's going to be very, very important as we go on. And we finish off right before we get to the Amidah. Sur Yisrael, Kuma be'ezrat Yisrael, Rock of Israel, rise up to aid Israel. Ufde chinumecha Yehuda Yisrael, and liberate or indeed redeem Judah and Israel as you promised, as was your intent. Go aleinu, right? Our Redeemer, Adonai Tziva'ot Shemo, the Lord of Hosts is his name. Kadosh Yisrael, the Holy One of Israel. And then we conclude, Baruch Atah Adonai Ga'al Yisrael. Blessed are you, Adonai, the one who redeemed Israel. Rather unusually, we use the past tense verb here. Normally, our prayers will finish with the present tense, but this was to reflect the tension. We are praising God specifically for something that we have witnessed. the redeeming that has already happened. We are hoping for redemption in the future, but we are looking here at the past redemption, in particular the redemption from Egypt. All right, we're going to go through some more examples. I know this is a lot, but I wanted to show you how almost every page of the Siddur has references to these comments. So never let anyone tell you Judaism doesn't care about the future. In the Shabbat Shacharit Kedusha, in the middle paragraph, we remind ourselves that V'timloch aleinu ki mechakim anachnu lach. We are waiting for you to reign over us. Matai timloch b'Tzion. When will it be that you will reign in Zion? Right? We are begging. We are desperate for God to bring the holiness that we see in the heavens, as talked about in the Kedusha, into the world itself. We hope that it will happen bekarov b'yameinu le'olam ba'ed tishkon. We hope that you will dwell, meaning there in this world as king quickly and in our days. And then titkadel b'titkadash b'toch Yerushalayim yircha, and then you will be exalted and sanctified within Jerusalem, your city, ledor vador lenetzach netzachim, for every generation and for all times. And then again, ve'einenu tir'ena malchutecha kadavar ha'amu. And then we will see indeed your sovereignty, your reign, as was said through the words of David, Mashiach, right? Your anointed one from your righteousness. So again, we'll have to come back to unpack what Mashiach means, but here we see David being called it, and yet that is talking about the past, but we know Mashiach is also used for the future. We will come back to that. Again, Yimloch Adonai le'olam, God will reign for all time. And of course, we then say in the Kedusha for Musaf, Hu Eloheinu, Hu Avinu, God is our king. God is He is our God. He is our Father. Hu Malkeinu, Hu Moshienu, Hu Yashmienu. He is the one that is our king. He is the one that is our deliverer. And Hu Yashmienu, and He will hear. Again, it's not quite the same word, so you got to pay close attention. Berachamav shenit le'enei kol chai. Right, and then He will bring about a second deliverance. Now, what is that second deliverance? Well, the first deliverance is, of course, the deliverance from Egypt. Our second deliverance, we are talking here in our Shenit about being the ultimate deliverance for the world. So that is aspirational language that, again, often goes under the radar because it has too much of a beautiful melody and people get caught up in singing it and not understanding the true import, even if they can translate the word. And then in the Musaf blessing for the day itself, we will remind ourselves Sheta'aleinu b'simcha la'artzenu, that we wish to be brought up in joy to our land, v'tita'enu bigvulenu, and plant us within the borders. Again, a restorative idea and agricultural again. And there we will be able to offer korbanot. We will be able to offer the sacrifices that you mandated. So in the traditional blessing for the Shabbat Musaf, we are talking again about our aspirations of returning explicitly to our land, of being planted within our borders, and of being able to offer up those sacrifices. All of those ideas are going to be critical to the Jewish concept of the end of days. Okay, we're getting there. We'll sort of speed run the last because I want to get to our summation so that we can go to some biblical texts of where all of this came from when we meet next time. So in the weekday Amidah, which is much more petitionary, which is only recited when it's not Shabbat or a holiday, and thus we are encouraged to be more petitionary rather than merely, in quotes, grateful and praising, we will say, right? Look upon our affliction, depend our cause, ug aleinu, and redeem us. Again, speedily for the sake of your name, because you are ki goel chazakata, because you are a mighty redeemer. Baruch atah Adonai, goel Yisrael. Here, unlike Emet V'Yatziv, we are actually referring to God in the present tense. You are the redeemer, right? This is asking that God perform the duties of redemption for us. Also in the weekday Amidah, Tekabah Shofar Gadol, blow the great shofar, which is a symbol of our the ingathering at the end of days, the trumpeting, if you will. Don't go too far down the Gabriel path here. Likabetz Luyotenu, and then you will gather us in. I gather in those who are dispersed, the exiles. And we refer to that again in Baruch Atah Adonai, Nikabetz Nidche Amo Yisrael, because you are the one who gathers in the dispersed of his people Israel. Later on in the weekday Amidah, B'Yerushalayim Yercha Barachamim Tashuv, and return with compassion or mercy to your city Jerusalem. And as you have said, Dibarta Uvne Ota B'Karov B'Yamenu Binyan Olam, right? And you will build it again, an eternal building. That this building, this restoration of its source will never go away. The Chisei David Mehera L'Tochat Achin, and the throne of David establish again. So David again is picking up here. Obviously, Jerusalem's restoration is coming rather strongly. We even finish off with Bonei Yerushalayim, something that is also echoed in Birkat Hamazon, and then immediately after in the Amidah, we get even more explicit about David, at Semach David, and the sprout of David. Again, that Semach idea, this sprouting idea, is found throughout our literature for our ideas of the end, that we Abdecha Meherat Tatzmiach, make it sprout soon. Vikarno Tarum Bishuatecha. Now, Vikarno is from the word Karen, which we see just below it in the bold text, literally means horn, and that's a tricky one. This is another poetic metaphor that doesn't work in modern English so well. It doesn't work in modern English partly because of the anti-Semitic idea that Jews have horns, and so saying to lift up his horn of David's horn seems a little bad. It also doesn't work because what we mean by horn doesn't work in modern English either. Horn was a symbol of strength and power because the ancient Israelites saw great beasts that had massive horns, and that was a symbol of power. The same way that an eagle's wing is a symbol of majesty and swiftness, or a lion's mane is symbol of the regalness. We considered horn to be a symbol of power because of the animals that lived among us, aurochs most importantly. And so lifting up his horn, Bishuatecha, is the idea that we are focusing on, that this is a symbol of a power that will bring about redemption. And why? Ki lishuatcha kivinu kol hayom, because we hope for your salvation every single day. Now, again, anyone who tells you Judaism doesn't focus on what's about to come is not paying attention to our Siddur, because there it is. Every single day, we are hoping for this, or at least we should be. If we lose that hope, well, we're in trouble, which is why it is a little disappointing that so much of Judaism tried to downplay this hope for many, many decades, almost 2 centuries in some communities. But thankfully, I think people are a little bit less ashamed to think about it. But please, as you'll find from this class, make sure that when you are hoping for the future, you are hoping for the future as Judaism describes it. Don't let another person, don't let another theology give you the map for what comes next, because you're going to get lost if you're using their map for our religion. All right. And then, of course, we talk about the restoration of the sacrifices in Ritzei. This happens in every Amidah. And then I've got a few more examples from other places. Elohai Neshama, the morning prayer where we thank God for the gift of our soul. We'll just go straight to the English because that, I think, is fine. We talk about God eventually taking the soul and then restoring it in the time to come. What do we mean by that? Well, we'll have to unpack it. But definitely we are acknowledging that death is not the end, that God indeed restores souls to dead bodies, that the death that we experience in this life from our point of view is not the end of the journey. What comes next? Well, you're going to have to stay tuned for our discussions to find out more about that. But again, every morning we wake up and remind ourselves of that. Every time we eat, we have the Birkat HaMazon, and the Birkat HaMazon again talks us about breaking the yoke from our neck, meaning our subjugation at the hands of others, and leading us with our dignity or upright to our land. It talks about God sending Elijah the prophet, who just came out of nowhere in all of these, but Elijah the prophet figures prominently in the narratives of the end of days. We also look for a day that is all Shabbat. And again, Shabbat is going to be a metaphor for what we are looking for at least some aspects of the world that is coming. But we're going to have to unpack that. But more obviously, we are saying, may we merit to live limot HaMashiach, ul chayei olam haba. We want to be able to live during the days of the Messiah and to have life in the worlds to come. Likewise, in El Maleh, our memorial prayer, we talk about the soul of our loved one, Began Eden Tiyeh Menuchato, being at rest in the Garden of Eden. So there as a metaphor for being at perfect peace in paradise. Again, we'll have to unpack that in more detail. And that this person is still bound up in the bond of life. Yigdal being a categorical statement of all of the beliefs that Rambam outlined for the centrality of Judaism, the 13 principles, so-called. I've got a video on that if you check my Pathways to Judaism class. Of course, is going to acknowledge the idea of justice, being good, God giving good to those that have done good, and God giving punishment to those who have done wrong, and that God will send a Messiah that will bring about deliverance or salvation and will restore life to the dead. Okay, so what can we glean from all of this? We're just going to do a very short, if all you had to go off was the Siddur, what would you know so far about Jewish beliefs about the coming of the future? Well, you'd get a bunch of R's: redeem, return, restore, reign, and resurrect. That is to say, we know that the theme of redemption, of Goel, is all over the place, because in the human context, when we use that term, somebody who redeems is somebody that is helping somebody that has been taken captive from their family or sold into slavery. And the Redeemer is the one that gets them out. Also, they are the one who will pursue justice for if somebody in their family was injured or killed. So clearly, we are looking at a Redeemer that is going to do something similar to that, redeeming us from whatever we're in, of bringing justice for whatever injustice or injuries we have endured. There definitely seems to be some notions there. Return. We talked about returning, restoring, rebuilding. Jews have been in exile twice after the Babylonian destruction, which we came back 70 years later, and since the Roman destruction, which is still going on today, maybe. We're going to have to talk about that many classes down the road, because there is a lot of discussion about the place of the modern state of Israel within our understanding of the timeline of these concepts. Is the modern state of Israel definitively, potentially, not part of this process? How do we understand it? And that is a very lively debate, and one that will, I'm sure, get us a lot of good discussion. Restore, clearly that's around. The house of David is very central to the idea of our restoration, but in particular, it seems to be tied up of breaking the yoke, of setting us free, is something about having David, or rather the house of David, prevents us from being under that foreign oppressive rule. Reigning, well, we couldn't talk more if we tried about God being central as king, but exactly what that malchut, that reign, that kingdom of God looks like, that's going to need to be unpacked. Again, that phrase in particular, kingdom of God, has been stolen by people with many political agendas that are counter to Judaism and counter to good governance, I might add. So we're going to have to work very carefully to free it up in order to understand what it means for us. And the resurrection, of course, the dead being restored to life, is also being mentioned all over the place in our Siddur. And then finally, of course, we have the most difficult of all words, say, Yeshua, right? Is this salvation, deliverance? What does this mean? hopefully you've come to at least see that many aspects of it are that this is not a one-time only thing, and that this in general has a concept that is saying there is an end to suffering. And suffering is something we're going to have to unpack, but in general, it seems to be that God doesn't want people to live in bad circumstances, and that the ultimate act of salvation is to remove those bad that bad state of living. We get a very specific example from the Exodus, but that lays out a template of what we mean when we're looking for a salvation. So next week, we will come back and we will begin our survey of biblical literature, because all of these concepts are rooted within biblical texts, some of it overtly, some of it obscurely. We'll look at some of the most famous texts, and also how many of the most famous texts have been misunderstood by people, and what Judaism means by them, both in their original context and then eventually as well within our fuller literature. All right, so that was an incredibly fast run through the Siddur. Obviously, you'll find many more examples now that you know what you're looking for, but continue to pray for a vision of the future that includes these types of things, and continue to refine that vision of the future as we study together. But on no account, give up hope in that future. And with that, I will bid you all a good day and be well.